A man marries her only because of a promise to the dead. A woman ventures into the wilderness where no one believes she can survive. The cattle ranchers laugh behind her back. The cattle tycoons treat her as if she were invisible. And her husband, the only one who should stand by her, keeps a cold distance, as if this marriage is a burden to be endured. But Lenora Hale didn't come to Texas to be loved. She came to build an empire. Like, leave a comment, the city you're viewing, and follow this story to the end. You won't want to miss anything. The wagon hit a rut in the road, and Lenora Hale grabbed the side rail with both hands, her knuckles going white, her hat nearly flying off her head into the dry Texas wind. She caught it with her free hand and pressed it back down, squashing the brim, and told herself this was fine. This was all fine. It was not fine. She had been traveling for 11 days. 11 days from Galveston, where her aunt had wept openly on the dock and pressed a Bible into her hands and said, "God be with you, child, because I don't know who else will be." Lenora had tucked the Bible into her trunk without comment. She wasn't sure she believed in signs or blessings or any of the things her aunt believed in, but she believed in keeping her mouth shut when it served her, and this had been one of those moments. The driver, a sun-baked old man named Pitcher, who smelled of tobacco and horse liniment, hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since picking her up at the railway station in Caldwell. He'd looked at her luggage, which was 2 trunks and a crate of books, and he'd looked at her, which was 23 years old, dark-haired, slight of build, wearing city clothes that were already dusty from the station platform, and he'd made a sound somewhere in the back of his throat that said everything he didn't bother to say out loud. She'd climbed up beside him without being invited, and he'd clicked at the horses, and they'd been riding in near silence for 6 hours. "How much farther?" she asked. "Hour. Maybe less if we don't break a wheel." She looked out at the land. In every direction it rolled out flat and vast and brutally honest. No trees to soften it, no hills to give it scale, just grass and sky and the occasional dust devil spinning itself out in the middle distance. The sky was the kind of blue that looked painted on. The heat was physical, a pressure against her face and arms. She had grown up in Galveston, where the Gulf breeze made everything bearable and the streets smelled of salt water and fish and commerce. She had spent 4 years at a women's college in Tennessee, studying animal husbandry and agricultural science alongside literature and mathematics, which had made her deeply unusual and not particularly marriageable, according to her father, who had said this with affection rather than criticism because her father had been an unusual man himself. Her father, Robert Hale, who had died 8 months ago of a fever that took him in 3 days, which was long enough for him to be sensible of it and short enough that there had been no real time to say anything that needed saying. He had been her closest friend in the world. He had also, it turned out, made a promise to a man named Voss without telling her about it. She'd learned about the promise from his lawyer 2 weeks after the funeral, in a small office that smelled of old paper. "Your father and Clarence Voss were friends for 30 years, the lawyer had said. In the last letter Clarence wrote before he died, he asked Robert to look after his son Colton, make sure the boy didn't lose the ranch. Robert wrote back and promised. He took it seriously. "My father is dead," Lenora had said. "Yes, which is why the promise fell to you." She had stared at the man. "You're the only one who can fulfill it," the lawyer said. "Your father had no son. You are the heir to whatever modest estate he left, which is, I'm sorry to say, quite modest. But you have one thing of value." He'd cleared his throat. "A marriage between you and Colton Voss would give the Voss Ranch a legal partner with capital enough to carry it through this difficult period. And it would honor your father's word. You're suggesting I marry a man I've never met because my dead father promised his dead father. I'm saying it's one option. What are the others?" He'd been quiet for a moment. "Your aunt in Galveston has offered—" "I know what my aunt has offered." Lenore had stood up. "I'll write to Mr. Voss." She had written. He had written back. Brief, factual, not unkind, but not warm either. And they had come to an arrangement that neither of them had called romantic, because it wasn't. It was a contract. He needed capital and a legal partner. She needed a future that didn't involve living in her aunt's house until someone more appropriate than herself agreed to marry her. They had met this arrangement with the same practical resignation 2 people might bring to a business merger they hadn't sought but couldn't refuse. She had told herself, on the boat and on the train, And now on this wagon lurching through the Texas hill country, that Practical was fine. Practical was honest. She had no illusions about what she was riding toward. She just hadn't expected the land to feel so enormous, so indifferent, like it was waiting to see if she'd flinch. She didn't flinch, but it was a near thing. The Voss Ranch came into view gradually. First the water tower, then the roofline of the main house, then the outbuildings spreading out behind it, corrals and barns and a bunkhouse and the slow shapes of cattle in the distance. It was bigger than she'd pictured from his letters, which had described it in terms of acreage and head count without giving any sense of what it felt like to see it. It felt like a small town that had decided to be a ranch instead. Pitcher pulled up in the yard and Lenora climbed down before he could offer to help, which he hadn't looked like he was going to do anyway. She stood in the dirt with her hat still slightly squashed and looked at the house. 2 stories, wood frame, wide porch, practical rather than pretty, and at the 3 men standing on that porch watching her arrive. One of them was leaning against the post with his arms crossed. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dusty work shirt and boots that had seen serious use. His face was weathered in the way that came from years in open sun, not old age. She estimated him at 30, maybe 32. He had dark eyes that were doing the same thing the land had done, assessing her without committing to an opinion. The other 2 were hands, she guessed. They were less careful about hiding what they thought. One of them said something to the other, and the other one laughed, quiet, but not quiet enough. She walked toward the porch. "Mr. Voss?" she said. "Miss Hale." He pushed off the post and came down the steps, and she saw he was even taller up close. He didn't smile, but he extended his hand, which she took. His grip was firm, without being theatrical about it. "You had a long ride." "I did." "Pitcher said the coach from Caldwell runs rough." "It does." They looked at each other for a moment. There was a kind of acknowledgement in it. 2 people recognizing that they were in an unusual situation and had elected, jointly and without discussion, to handle it by not making a production of it. "I'll show you the house," he said. Behind her, one of the hands said, not quietly enough, "She's smaller than I figured." Colton didn't turn around, but his jaw tightened slightly. "That'll be all, Draper." The man went quiet. They were married 4 days later by a justice of the peace in the nearest town, which was a place called Delwood, with a main street and a feed store and 3 saloons and a post office. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Lenora wore the best dress she'd brought, which was dark blue wool, entirely wrong for the heat, and Colton wore a clean shirt and a jacket he looked uncomfortable in. 2 of his hands stood as witnesses and shook hands with him afterward and nodded at her in a way that was polite without being welcoming. The woman behind the counter at the feed store, whose name was Mrs. Garfield, watched Lenora sign the register and said, "Hale? Robert Hale's daughter? From Galveston?" "Yes," Lenora said. Mrs. Garfield smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, Texas is different from Galveston." "I imagine it is," Lenora said. She got very good at that kind of exchange over the following weeks, the ones where someone told her, in some form or another, that she didn't belong here and couldn't possibly understand, wrapped in a smile that was really a door closing. She got good at nodding and saying something non-committal and then going back to the ranch and reading everything she could get her hands on. She had brought crates of books, agricultural journals, breeding records, livestock management texts, soil composition studies, water table surveys of the Central Texas region. She'd been collecting them for 2 years before her father died, half because it genuinely interested her, and half because she'd always had a feeling, shapeless and hard to explain, that she was going to need to know things. Specific, practical, unglamorous things. She set up her books in the small room off the kitchen that was ostensibly a parlor but had probably never been used for parlor purposes. She spread maps across the table. She started keeping a notebook. Colton noticed. He didn't say anything about it at first, just glanced at the room when he passed the doorway, at the papers and the open books and the notes she made in her compact, precise handwriting. He had the expression of a man who was reserving judgment, which was better than the expression of a man who'd already made it. They were polite to each other. More than polite, actually. Careful. They ate dinner together most evenings, and he told her things about the ranch in a straightforward way as if briefing a business partner, which she supposed was accurate. She asked questions. He answered them. There were no long silences that needed filling because they'd both independently decided that the important thing right now was function, not feeling. She had her own room. He hadn't suggested otherwise, and she hadn't expected otherwise. This was fine. She kept telling herself that. What was less fine was the hands. There were 8 of them. Pitcher, who drove the wagon and did odd jobs and seemed largely indifferent to the world. A heavy-set man named Burke, who ran the cattle work and was competent and quiet. 2 younger men, brothers, called the Marsh Boys, who were decent workers and did what they were told. And then Draper. Draper was the problem. Wade Draper had been with the ranch for 6 years, which he mentioned frequently, and which seemed to give him, in his own estimation, a kind of authority that the formal hierarchy of the place didn't actually confer. He was maybe 28, good-looking in a loud way, and he had the kind of confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged. He wasn't stupid. That was the thing that made him more difficult than a stupid man would have been. He was perceptive enough to understand exactly where Lenora's vulnerabilities were, and creative enough to press them in ways that were hard to call out directly. He never said anything overtly rude. He was careful about that because Colton had made it clear, in that first moment in the yard, that certain behavior wasn't acceptable. But Draper worked in implications, in the slight hesitation before he answered her questions, in the way he addressed her answers to Colton rather than to her, as if she'd been speaking through a translator, in the tiny smile when something she said was met with skepticism by one of the other men. The other hands took their cues from him, because that's how it works when there's a man like Draper in a group. Everyone orbits him without quite realizing it. She said nothing about it to Colton, not because she was afraid, but because she knew that if she went to her husband to complain about his men after 2 weeks, she would confirm every assumption they'd made about her. She would be the city woman who couldn't handle things. She would be the problem instead of the person solving one. So she watched, and she learned, and she kept her mouth shut until she knew enough to open it. The ranch ran about 2,000 head of longhorns, which was respectable but not dominant. There were 3 or 4 operations in the county that ran twice that many and had the leverage to match. The Voss land was good land, Lenora had determined, studying the soil surveys and walking the pastures in the early mornings while the heat was still manageable. Good grass, decent water access from a creek that ran along the eastern edge, and topography that would allow for expansion if someone wanted to push into the southern section. The problem was the market. She hadn't understood it fully from the letters and the books, but she understood it now that she was here and listening. The cattle market in this part of Texas was controlled effectively by a buying consortium called the Western Beef Syndicate, 3 men who had structured their buying arrangements in such a way that every rancher in the county had to sell through them. The prices they offered were not negotiable. They set the price before the season, and that was the price. And if you didn't like it, you could try to drive your cattle north yourself, which cost more in time and losses than it saved in margin. The ranchers accepted this because they'd accepted it for years, and because men like that accepted things that had been true for years the way they accepted weather, as a condition of existence rather than a problem to solve. Lenora did not accept it that way, but she kept that to herself for now. She was sitting in her study room on a Wednesday evening about 6 weeks after arriving, working through a breeding document she'd gotten from a journal out of Kansas City when Colton appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame with his arms crossed. She'd noticed he did this when he was thinking something through and hadn't decided yet whether to say it. "You've been walking the south pasture," he said. "Most mornings, yes." "Why?" She looked up at him. "I wanted to understand the land." "You could have asked me." "I know." She paused. "I learn better by seeing." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you see?" She set down her pen. This was the first time he'd asked, not commented, not informed, asked. She decided to answer honestly and see what happened. "The south section is underutilized. The grass variety there is actually better suited to heavier cattle than longhorns, and the creek access could support a significantly larger herd if the channel was cleared." She watched his face. "I also saw that your current herd has some animals that aren't pulling their weight in terms of body weight gain. The genetics are inconsistent. You've got some excellent animals mixed in with stock that's just—" She searched for the right word. "Adequate." Colton looked at her for a long moment. "You studied cattle breeding." Among other things, your father's lawyer mentioned something about that. He paused. I thought he was being generous. He wasn't. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but attention. The specific kind of attention a man pays when he realizes he's been underestimating something. All right, he said. What else? She hesitated because what she had to say next was not small. I've been looking at your market arrangements with the Western Beef Syndicate. His face closed slightly. That's how business gets done here. It's how business has gotten done here. It doesn't have to be how it gets done. Lenora. He said her name in a specific way, measured and careful, the way he said things when he was about to be patient about something that was trying his patience. The syndicate controls the buyers. They control the processing houses. There isn't another route to market. There might be, she said. If someone built one. He looked at her for another moment, and then he straightened up from the doorframe and said, Get some sleep, and walked away. She stared at the doorway for a while after he was gone. Then she picked up her pen and kept working. Whoops. The trouble with Draper came to a head on a Thursday in late September. She had gone to the barn to speak to Burke about the condition of 3 animals she'd noticed in the east pasture. They were showing signs of a particular nutritional deficiency she'd read about, and she wanted to address it before it progressed. Burke wasn't there, but Draper was, along with 2 of the younger hands, doing something with a saddle that didn't look urgent. She explained what she'd seen. She used clear, specific language because she'd found that being specific reduced the opportunity for misinterpretation. Draper listened with that patient look he used, the one that meant he was deciding how to be dismissive without being technically rude. When she finished, he said, We've been running cattle here for going on 7 years, Mrs. Voss. We know what a sick animal looks like. I didn't say they were sick. I said they were showing early signs of mineral deficiency. And we appreciate the concern. He said it the way a man says something he does not appreciate. But this is ranch work. It's better left to the people who know what they're doing. The 2 younger hands looked at the floor. They weren't cruel, she'd decided. They just didn't want trouble. And Draper was the kind of man who created it for people who got in his way. She looked at Draper and said with absolute calm, The 3 animals are in the northeast corner of the east pasture. They're showing pale mucous membranes and reduced coat quality, which indicates copper deficiency. If it goes untreated, they'll lose significant weight before spring, which affects your numbers at sale. I'll leave a note about the supplement protocol on the barn board. You can use it or not. She left the note. She walked back to the house. That evening, she heard Draper in the yard talking to the Marsh boys. She couldn't hear the words, but she heard the tone, and she recognized it. The tone men use when they're comfortable enough with their own opinion of someone that they don't bother to lower their voices. She sat at her table and wrote in her notebook and said nothing about it. 2 weeks later, Burke mentioned to Colton at dinner that the 3 animals she'd flagged had improved considerably since the supplement was added to their feed. Colton looked at her across the table. She was eating her potatoes and didn't look up. That October brought the start of what would turn out to be a bad year. She didn't know it was a bad year yet. It just felt like a hard fall, which was something different. The rains that should have come in September had held off. The creek was lower than it should have been. Colton spent more hours than usual writing fence lines and checking water sources and coming home in the evening with a particular set to his jaw that she was learning to read. She began cross-referencing what she was seeing against the water table surveys she'd brought and against a weather pattern study she'd found in an agricultural quarterly from the year before. The patterns were not comforting. She also began quietly to write letters. She wrote to a cattle buyer in Fort Worth who had been mentioned in a trade journal as someone interested in direct purchasing relationships. She wrote to a ranching cooperative in Kansas that had experimented with breeding programs she'd been studying. She wrote to a professor at a Texas agricultural college whose paper on longhorn crossbreeding had been the most interesting thing she'd read in the past year. She kept copies of all of it in her notebook in her careful handwriting. She said nothing about the letters to Colton. Not because she was hiding anything exactly, but because she didn't have anything to show him yet. She was building something. You didn't show someone a building when it was still foundation. In the meantime, she learned the ranch. She learned it the way she learned things, methodically, with her eyes open and her mouth mostly closed. She learned the names of all 8 hands and their particular skills and limitations. She learned which pastures held water longest in dry weather and which went brittle first. She learned the cattle themselves, which animals were which by sight, which were strong and which were merely functional, which had the kind of bone structure and temperament that could pass something useful to the next generation. She spent an afternoon with Colton going over the breeding records he kept, which were detailed enough to show he wasn't careless, but not detailed enough to show he'd been thinking about it the way she had. "You've got 4 bulls," she said, pointing to the record. "But this one," she tapped a line, "is doing almost all the work genetically. These other 3 are barely contributing to the herd quality." Colton leaned over the book. He smelled like leather and dust and something woodsy she hadn't identified. "He's the best animal on the property." "I know. That's actually the issue. You've got 1 strong genetic line and 3 weak ones. You need more diversity, and you need it from the outside. There's a breeder in Gonzales County who's been crossing Longhorns with Durham bulls. The offspring are bigger, heavier, and they fatten faster." Colton looked at the book for a moment. "That costs money we don't have." "Not this year," she agreed. "But it's what needs to happen when we do." He didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. He looked at her with that expression he was developing, the one that wasn't quite trust yet, but was something in its direction, like a man walking out onto ice, feeling for the solid parts. "You think about the future a lot," he said. "I think about the present with the future in mind," she said. "There's a difference." He considered this. Then he straightened up and said, "I've got fence to check," and left. She stayed at the table and turned back to the breeding records and kept working. November came in cold and dry. The drought was real now, not a possibility, but a fact. The water in the creek was down to a trickle in the lower sections, and Colton had been moving cattle to find better grass, which meant the herd was more spread out and harder to manage, which meant the hands were tired and stretched thin and consequently less cheerful than usual. She was in the yard one morning helping Pitcher patch a fence post near the house. It was the kind of small, obvious task that nobody had prioritized, and she'd decided to do herself, when she heard Burke's voice across the yard speaking to Colton. "Draper wants to know about the south pasture," Burke said, "whether we're moving the main herd there." "Not yet," Colton said. "Grass will be gone in a week if we put them all in. He figures it's better than where they are. Tell him I'll let him know." She went back to the fence post. She was not supposed to be listening, and she had heard it anyway, and what it told her was that Draper was lobbying Colton over her head about things she hadn't even been consulted on, which was interesting because she hadn't voiced an opinion about the south pasture to anyone. But Draper had noticed her walking it. He'd been watching her, same as she'd been watching him. He was making a move, she realized, trying to get the south pasture decision made before she could weigh in on it, to establish, in the small politics of the ranch, that her opinion hadn't mattered. She set down the hammer and went to find Colton. He was near the water trough, talking to one of the Marsh boys, and he looked up when she came over with the particular expression he used when he was bracing for something he wasn't sure he wanted. "The south pasture," she said. "Don't move the main herd there yet." He looked at her. "The grass is better," she said, "but the soil in that section holds moisture longer because of the clay composition. If we put the whole herd on it now, we'll compact the top layer before winter, and it won't recover well in spring. We should keep it in reserve and graze the north ridge first, even though the grass is thinner. Rotate in segments." He was quiet for a moment. The Marsh boy was looking at the ground. "How do you know the soil composition?" Colton said. "I tested it, about a month after I got here. I used a kit from one of the journals. You take core samples and run a basic analysis." She paused. "I should have mentioned it." He looked at her for another long moment. She could not tell what he was thinking, which was unusual. She'd gotten fairly good at reading him. Then he said to the Marsh boy, "Tell Draper we're grazing the north ridge first. Rotation schedule. I'll have something written up by tonight." The Marsh boy nodded and went. Colton looked back at Lenora. "You tested the soil," he said. "Yes." "On the whole south section?" "The whole south section." He made a sound somewhere in his throat. Not dismissive, not approving, somewhere between the two. Then he said, "I need to know these things when you find them out." "I know," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd want to know." Something crossed his face. Complicated and quick and then gone. "This is your ranch too," he said, and turned and walked back toward the barn. She stood in the yard for a moment, in the cold November air, and noticed that something had shifted. Some small weight she'd been carrying had moved just a little to a different place. She went back to the fence post. She was there to see it when the first letter came back. The buyer in Fort Worth, a man named Aldous Pruitt, wrote in careful commercial language that he was interested in learning more about a direct purchasing arrangement and what kind of volume she was thinking about. His letter was 2 pages long and professional, and she read it 3 times standing at the kitchen table before she put it in her notebook. She still didn't say anything to Colton, not yet. The foundation wasn't ready yet. What she did do that evening was sit across from him at dinner and say, "I want to ask you something." He looked up from his plate. "If there was a way to sell outside the syndicate," she said, "at better prices and with more predictable terms, would you consider it?" He held her gaze. "That depends on what the way was." "I know, I'm not there yet." She picked up her fork. "I just want to know if you're willing to consider it." Colton was quiet for a while. Outside, the wind was picking up. They'd had a stretch of cold evenings, and she'd gotten used to the sound of it against the walls, which was different from the sound of wind off the Gulf, lower and drier and less yielding. "The syndicate's been here as long as the cattle business," he said. "They've got connections to every processing house in the region." "I know." "Going against them means going against men who can make things very difficult." "I know that too." He looked at her, really looked at her, in the particular way he rarely did, which was direct and without the careful blankness he used as a default, like he was trying to see something underneath the surface. "What are you planning?" he said. "I'm not planning anything yet," she said. "I'm building toward a plan. There's a difference." He was quiet again. Then, slowly, he said, "All right." She looked at him. "All right," he said again. "I'll consider it." She looked back at her plate. She picked up her fork. Outside, the wind came against the wall and the lamp on the table moved slightly, just a flicker, and then it held. This was the part nobody talked about, the beginning of things. Not the big moments, not the decisions that changed everything, but the earlier ones, the smaller ones, where one person asked and another said yes, where something that had been theoretical became possible, where a woman sitting across a dinner table from a man she'd married out of necessity felt, for the first time, like she might be building something here after all. She didn't let herself feel it too much. There was still too much to do. The drought was getting worse. The syndicate was still there. Draper was still watching. The South herd still had genetic problems that weren't going to fix themselves. But Pruitt's letter was in her notebook. She had 6 more letters sent, and Colton Voss had just said he would consider it. She ate her dinner. She kept her face neutral. But something, somewhere in the careful architecture she'd been building inside herself since Galveston, had shifted just enough to feel like the start of something real. The drought did not break in December. Lenore had been hoping it might, not out of optimism, exactly, but out of the practical recognition that some problems solve themselves if you wait long enough. This was not one of those problems. January came in hard and dry and cold, the creek reduced to a series of standing pools that the cattle were beginning to fight over, and she could see in the way Colton came home each evening, hat pulled low, shoulders carrying something heavier than tiredness, that he was running the numbers in his head and not liking what they added up to. She was running them too, in her notebook, and she didn't like them either. The winter hay reserves were being consumed faster than projected because the pasture grass had given out early. Burke had estimated they had enough feed to carry the herd through to March if conditions held, but conditions were not holding. The cattle were losing weight, not catastrophically, not yet, but steadily, in the slow grinding way that a drought does its damage. Not all at once, but week by week, a little more, until one morning you looked at the numbers and realized you were already past the point you'd been trying not to reach. She was at her table on a Friday evening working through a feed cost projection when Colton came in and sat down across from her without being asked. He didn't do this often. He was generally careful about the boundaries of her working space in the way he was careful about most boundaries, giving her room the way he'd give anyone room. When he sat down without being invited, it meant something had happened. "Got word from Harlan Peck today," he said. She put down her pen. Harlan Peck was one of the 3 men who ran the Western Beef Syndicate. She'd never met him, but she'd learned his name the way she'd learned all the relevant names, quietly, from letters and local talk, building a picture of him piece by piece. He was the one who did the talking. The other two, Ruth and Cain, were money and muscle, respectively, but Peck was the face. "He's adjusting the spring purchase price," Colton said. "Down 18%. She was quiet for a moment. "From last year's already reduced price." "Yes." "On what grounds?" Colton's jaw tightened. "Market conditions," he said. "National beef prices are soft. Overproduction in the northern territories." He paused. "Which may even be partly true." "And partly not." "Partly not," he agreed. She pulled the feed cost sheet toward her and looked at it. 18% below last year's price, applied to a herd that had already lost weight during the drought, running against hay reserves that were draining faster than planned. She did the arithmetic in her head. It didn't work. It was not close to working. "Every rancher in the county is getting the same notice," Colton said. "Peck sent it to all of them. And they'll accept it. They don't see another option." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was the only warm thing in the room right then. "There are other options," she said. "Lenora." There was that measured tone again. But this time there was something underneath it that wasn't patience. It was something more like fear that had put on the clothes of patience to get through the front door. "I've been in contact with a buyer in Fort Worth," she said. "His name is Aldous Pruitt. He's been purchasing directly from ranches in the northern part of the state, and he's looking to expand his network southward. He's willing to discuss price per hundredweight. That's 15 to 20% above what the syndicate is offering, even at their new rate." Colton stared at her. "You've been in contact." "Since November." "Since November, so," he repeated. "I wasn't ready to say anything until I knew it was real." She pushed the letter across the table. She'd been keeping it in her notebook, but had taken it out this morning, as if she'd known this conversation was coming. "He's serious. He's got processing arrangements in Fort Worth that don't go through any of the syndicate's houses." Colton picked up the letter and read it. She watched him read it. He read it twice, which meant he was being careful rather than dismissive, which was a good sign. "Going to Pruitt means going around Peck," he said, setting the letter down. "Yes. Peck has relationships with every buying agent and every processing house in this part of Texas. In this part, not in Fort Worth. If he finds out we've cut him out, he'll make it his business to hurt us." "He's already hurting us," she said. "The only difference is whether we're getting something for it or not." Colton sat back in his chair. He had a way of going still when he was thinking seriously. Not tense, just genuinely quiet, like something in him had gone to a different room to work on the problem. She waited. "This isn't just about us," he said finally. "If other ranchers see what we're doing and want in, Peck will come after all of them. They didn't ask for that." "No," she said, "but they might want it if they saw it working. And if it doesn't work?" She looked at him directly. "Then we deal with that." He picked up the letter again, set it down, looked at the window, which showed nothing but dark and the reflection of the lamp. "I want to meet Pruitt before anything's decided." "That's reasonable." "And I want to understand the logistics. How do we move cattle to Fort Worth without the syndicate knowing? They've got eyes on every major trail in this county." "I know. I've been working on that." She reached into the notebook and produced 2 more sheets, hand-drawn maps with routes marked in her precise lines. "There are 3 alternate routes. The most viable goes northeast through Callahan County. It's longer, adds about 4 days to the drive, but it doesn't cross any land Peck's people control." Colton looked at the maps. He looked at them for a long time. "You drew these yourself," he said. "I rode them too. Last month, 3 of them, on the days you were at the south fence." He looked up at her. "You were gone 3 days in December." "Yes?" "I thought you were—" He stopped. "What?" "I thought you were visiting someone in town. Mrs. Garfield mentioned she hadn't seen you." He was clearly recalibrating something in his head. "You were scouting cattle routes." "I was scouting cattle routes," she confirmed. He put the maps down on the table between them, alongside the letter, alongside the feed cost projections she'd been working on. He looked at all of it together for a moment, this collection of things she'd been building, quietly, in the evenings and the early mornings, and the days he thought she was somewhere else. All right, he said. His voice was different than it had been at the start of the conversation. Not warm, not transformed. Colton Voss was not a man who transformed easily, but something in it had settled, like a question he'd been carrying had gotten part of an answer. I'll write to Prewitt. She had expected the neighbors to be difficult. She had not entirely anticipated how specifically and personally they would be difficult. The community of ranchers in and around Delwood was not large, maybe a dozen families with significant operations, and another 15 or 20 with smaller holdings. They had their own social structure, their own long memories, their own ledger of who owed what to whom. Lenore had understood from early on that she was an outsider to this structure, not just because she was new, but because she was a woman who spoke about cattle breeding and market strategy, which made her the specific kind of outsider that some people found threatening rather than merely foreign. She found this out in a direct way in February, at a gathering that the Delwood ranchers held every year at the Craddock Place, a sprawling operation 6 miles east of the Voss Ranch, run by a heavy-set, opinionated man named Curtis Craddock, who had strong views about almost everything and was not shy about sharing them. She went with Colton because it seemed right, because she was his wife, and this was the community they lived in, and she was trying to understand it. She wore the dark blue wool dress again, which she'd had cleaned and pressed, and she told herself she didn't care what anyone thought of it. The gathering was in the Craddock's large front room, 20-some people, and she and Colton had barely gotten through the door before Curtis Craddock was shaking Colton's hand and looking at her the way a man looks at a problem that has followed someone home. "Colton, good to see you, and this is—" He didn't finish the sentence, just let it hang there, which forced her to finish it herself. "Lenora Voss," she said, and extended her hand. He shook it briefly. "Heard you've been making changes out at the Voss place." "Some adjustments," she said. He turned back to Colton. "Droughts hit you hard?" "Hit everyone hard," Colton said. She stood beside him and listened and smiled when smiled at and said appropriate things when addressed, which was not often. She was aware, with the particular awareness of someone who has spent a lot of time being underestimated, of the conversations happening around the edges of the room, the way 2 women near the fireplace went quiet when she walked past, the way a rancher named Bellew looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking back. She found herself standing next to a woman named Clara Mast, whose husband ran a mid-sized operation to the west, who was the first person that evening to speak to her, like she was a person rather than a footnote. "You're the one who's been reading all those agricultural journals," Clara said. She was maybe 40, plain-faced and direct, and she said it without any particular judgment in either direction. "I do read them, yes. My husband thinks women who read agricultural journals are trying to humiliate someone." Clara picked up a glass from the sideboard. "I think he's being dramatic." Lenora almost smiled. "What do you think of the syndicate's new price announcement?" Clara looked at her sideways. "What does any of us think? We don't like it, and we'll accept it anyway." "Why?" "Because that's how it works." "It doesn't have to work that way." Clara was quiet for a moment, studying her. "You're one of those people," she said finally. "Which kind?" "The kind who sees a wall and thinks it can be moved." She didn't say it unkindly. "Most of us have been living next to that wall our whole lives. We've made peace with it." "I understand that," Lenora said. "I'm just not sure peace with it is the best available outcome." She said it quietly, not as a challenge. She wasn't interested in making enemies she didn't need. But Clara heard the substance of it and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "If you ever figure out how to move it, let me know," and moved off toward the fireplace. The real trouble came later, when the conversation in the room shifted to the drought and the price cut, and Curtis Craddock said, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, that what they needed to do was go together to peck and negotiate as a group rather than individually. Colton said carefully, "There might be other approaches worth looking at." Craddock looked at him. "Such as?" "Direct buyer relationships, outside the syndicate's network." The room went slightly quieter. She could feel it, the specific silence of people paying attention while trying to look like they're not. "That's not realistic," Craddock said. "The syndicate controls access to the processing houses. You go outside them, you've got cattle with no place to go." "There are processing arrangements in Fort Worth," Lenora said. She had not planned to say it, but Craddock had said that thing, not realistic, in the tone that meant he thought the discussion was over, and she'd heard that tone enough times in her life to have a visceral response to it. Craddock looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the doorway, as a problem. Ma'am, with respect, the Fort Worth buyers are 300 miles away. 340 by the main trail, about 300 by an alternate route through Callahan County. She kept her voice level. The price difference per hundredweight, even accounting for drive costs, works out favorable. The room was definitely quiet now. Craddock's face had gone through a couple of expressions and settled on something that was trying to be tolerant. Running cattle 300 miles on an alternate route in drought conditions with a depleted herd would cost money, yes. Less money than accepting an 18% price cut if the volume is sufficient. She paused. I've done the arithmetic. I'm sure you have, Craddock said, in the tone of a man who has never once doubted that he was the smartest person in any room he walked into. But this isn't arithmetic. This is ranching. Someone in the room made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been a suppressed laugh. She couldn't tell. Colton said quietly, Lenora. She stopped. She looked at him. His expression said, not here, not now, I understand, but not here. She looked back at Craddock. Of course, she said, and picked up her glass. On the ride home, in the wagon, in the cold dark, she and Colton didn't speak for the first several miles. The horses knew the way. The stars were out and very bright, which happened in drought conditions, she'd read, something about particulates in the air. You shouldn't have said it the way you said it, Colton said. I know. Craddock's vain about his judgment. You made him look like he hadn't thought of something obvious. He hadn't thought of it. That's not the point. She was quiet for a moment. I know that's not the point. I understand how this works. You don't challenge men like Craddock directly. You let them think the idea was theirs. She looked at the road ahead. I just find it exhausting. Colton was quiet for a moment. So do I sometimes, he said, which surprised her. She looked at him. His profile in the dark was unreadable. He's not wrong that the drive would be hard, Colton said. Drought conditions, depleted animals. I know. You'd need more hands for a drive that long. That costs money. I know that too. And if something goes wrong on the trail, Colton. She said his name the way he sometimes said hers, measured, because she needed him to hear her, and not just the problem. I know every objection. I've spent 3 months thinking about every objection. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm asking you to keep your mind open. He drove for a while. She waited. My mind is open, he said. It wasn't enthusiasm, but it was something she could work with. The rustlers hit in March. She heard about it before Colton got home. Burke came up to the house in the early afternoon. His horse lathered, his face doing the thing faces do when someone is carrying bad news and knows it. She came out onto the porch before he could knock. How many? She said. He blinked. How did you... You rode hard. How many? 60-some head, he said. Northeast pasture, overnight. They cut the fence clean and drove them out through the Callahan property boundary. She felt it in her stomach. Not panic, but a cold settling weight. 60 animals. In drought conditions with weight already down, 60 animals was not just a number. It was a serious wound. Colton came home 2 hours later and she watched him absorb it. He was good at absorbing bad things. He'd been doing it for years, she'd gathered, dealing with his father's debts and the land issues and the drought before this drought, the accumulated weight of keeping a place alive that kept trying to die. He absorbed this the same way. He got quiet and then he got practical, and the only sign of how much it cost him was the way he stood in the kitchen afterward, just standing there for a moment with his hand on the back of a chair, not holding it, just touching it. Sheriff will want to look at the fence line, he said. Burke already sent word. Sheriff McCallum's coming tomorrow. He nodded. There's something else, she said. He looked at her. The break in the fence. Burke said they cut it clean. She paused. The northeast pasture fence was repaired 3 weeks ago. New wire. You don't cut new wire cleanly in the dark unless you know where it is and you've done it before. Colton went still in that thinking way of his. Someone who knows the property. or someone who was told? He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't say Draper's name. She didn't have to. She could see him thinking it, turning it over, setting it down because he couldn't afford what it meant if it was true. "Don't say it," he said very quietly. "I'm not saying it," she said. "I'm saying it's worth thinking about." Sheriff McCallum came and looked at the fence line and made notes and said the things sheriffs say, which were thorough and unsatisfying. He had no particular leads. He suggested it might be itinerant rustlers working the drought-stressed ranches, which was plausible, which was also exactly what someone would say if they wanted an explanation that didn't lead anywhere. She went back to her table that evening and sat for a long time without writing anything. The drought. The price cut. 60 head gone. And Colton was right about the drive. It would be hard, harder than the numbers showed because numbers didn't carry cattle or deal with exhausted hands or negotiate with a hostile county. She thought about her father, which she tried not to do too often because it made the room feel smaller. He had been a man who believed in building from what you had rather than mourning what you didn't. He used to say, when things went wrong, that the situation had clarified, which was a way of saying that now you knew exactly what you were dealing with. The situation, she thought, had clarified. She picked up her pen and started writing. She wrote 2 letters that evening, one to Prewitt in Fort Worth, proposing a specific meeting date and a preliminary volume commitment that was lower than she wanted but achievable given current conditions. One to the agricultural college professor, whose name was Dr. James Whitfield, asking about the availability of 2 Durham Cross bulls for a breeding program she was finally ready to describe in concrete terms rather than theoretical ones. She also started a 3rd document, not a letter, a plan. 4 pages by the time she was done. A cooperative structure. Instead of one ranch making the Fort Worth drive alone, multiple ranches pooling their herds and their hands, sharing the cost and the risk, delivering a volume that would make Prewitt genuinely eager rather than merely interested. She knew the ranchers wouldn't want it at first. Craddock had made that clear. But Craddock wasn't every rancher. Clara Mass's husband had said something at the gathering about watching his margins disappear. She'd overheard it and filed it. There were 2 or 3 others she'd mentally cataloged as people who were frustrated enough to be persuadable if the numbers were right. The numbers could be made right. She'd been making them right in her notebook for months. She heard Colton moving around in the other part of the house. She'd learned his sounds, the particular weight of his step, the way he was quiet when he was tired versus quiet when he was thinking. This sounded like both. She almost called out, almost said, "Come look at this." But it was past 10 and the plan needed another day's work, and she'd learned that showing him something half-built just gave him more things to object to before he could see the shape of it. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. In the morning, she found that someone had left a cup of coffee outside her study room door, still warm. She stood in the doorway holding it for a moment, looking down the hall where Colton had already gone out to start the day's work, and she felt something that she didn't have a clean name for. Not gratitude exactly, because it was too small a word, and not love, because that felt like reaching for something she wasn't sure she'd been given permission to hold. Something between the two. Something that lived in the specific space between duty and care, which was, she was starting to think, where most of the important things in a life actually happened. She drank the coffee and went back to her plan. Draper quit on a Wednesday in late March. He didn't quit exactly. He had a conversation with Colton that she wasn't present for, behind the barn, that lasted about 20 minutes, and then he came out and loaded his gear and rode off. She watched him go from the kitchen window without letting herself feel anything particular about it. Colton came in for dinner that evening and sat down, and she put food on the table and sat across from him. "Draper?" she said. "Gone." "What happened?" He looked at his plate. He had opinions about how things were being run. I disagreed. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "Are you going to replace him?" she said. "I'm thinking about it. Burke can take on some of what he was doing. The Marsh boys are better than Draper gave them credit for." He paused. "I may ask around about hiring someone who's done long-distance cattle drives." She looked at him. He met her eyes briefly. "Fort Worth," he said. "If we're doing this, we need people who know how to do it." She took a breath that she didn't let be audible. "I have a proposal for how to structure it," she said. A cooperative model, multiple ranches sharing the drive. He reached for the bread. Show me after dinner. She showed him after dinner. He read all 4 pages, which took a while, and asked questions that were specific and practical and occasionally difficult, which meant he was taking it seriously. She answered the ones she could and wrote down the ones she couldn't so she could answer them later. At the end, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then at her. Prewitt's willing to take this volume, he said. He's willing to discuss it. I need a meeting to confirm the specifics. And you think Mast would come in? Bellew? Possibly, not Craddock. No, he agreed, not Craddock. He drummed his fingers once on the table. This is a significant risk. I know. If the drive fails, or if Prewitt's terms aren't what you're expecting, or if Peck finds out before we're far enough down the road. I know, she said. He looked at her. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying I want you to know I know it's a risk. I know it's a risk, she said steadily. I've known it for months. The risk of doing nothing is also real. We just don't count it the same way because we're used to it. Colton was quiet. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right. All right. Talk to Prewitt. Get the meeting. He stood up from the table. And if Mast is willing to have a conversation, I'll go with you. She watched him go. She sat at the table for a few minutes in the quiet of the house with the plan spread out in front of her and the lamp throwing shadows on the walls and thought about how much could change and how much still had to. The syndicate was still out there. The drought was still grinding on. The 60 head were still gone and the herd was still underweight. None of that was resolved. None of it was close to resolved. But Draper was gone. And Colton had said all right. And somewhere in Fort Worth, Aldous Prewitt was going to receive a letter in the next week proposing a meeting that had the potential to change everything about how cattle moved in this part of Texas. She folded the plan, put it in her notebook, and started thinking about what she was going to say to Prewitt when she met him. Aldous Prewitt was not what she'd expected. She had built a picture of him from his letters. Careful, commercial, the kind of man who weighed every word before committing it to paper. And she had expected someone older, more formal, with the particular stiffness of a man who had made money by being cautious. What she got was a compact, quick-eyed man of maybe 45 who met them at the door of his Fort Worth office in his shirt sleeves and shook her hand before he shook Colton's, which she noted, and which she suspected he intended her to note. Mrs. Voss, he said, your letters were the most interesting thing I read last fall. I hope they hold up in person, she said. So far. He gestured them inside. The office was on the second floor of a building on a busy commercial street, and through the window she could see the stockyards in the middle distance, the pens and the chutes and the slow movement of cattle in the morning light. She had read about the Fort Worth yards, but seeing them was different. The scale of it. The sheer organized mass of animals and commerce moving together. Colton saw her looking. Bigger than you pictured? Much bigger, she said. Prewitt poured coffee without asking whether they wanted it and spread a map across his desk, a large one, hand-annotated, showing the cattle country of Central and South Texas with routes marked in different colors. She recognized 2 of the colors immediately as the routes she'd scouted herself, which meant he'd done his own research, which meant he was serious. Your cooperative proposal, he said, sitting down. Walk me through the numbers. She walked him through the numbers. She had them memorized, but she also had them written in the notebook she'd brought, and she went through them in order. Estimated head count from the 3 ranches she expected to participate, projected weight at delivery accounting for drive losses, price per hundredweight, transport and labor costs, net margin compared to syndicate rates. She'd done the calculations twice, with different conservative assumptions each time, and both versions came out favorable. Prewitt listened without interrupting, which was the sign of a man who actually listened rather than a man waiting to talk. When she finished, he asked 6 questions, all of them specific, all of them things she'd thought about. She answered 5 of them directly. The 6th, about his processing capacity on the receiving end, she turned back to him. That's your side of the equation, she said. What can you guarantee on volume and timing? He looked at her for a moment, then at Colton, then back at her. She always like this? He said to Colton. More or less, Colton said. Prewitt smiled. It was a real smile, not the social kind. My processing arrangement can handle up to 600 head per delivery, with a minimum of 3 days' notice before arrival. Price is fixed for the season at contract signing. No adjustments for market conditions. He paused. That last part is the one your friends at the syndicate won't match. It's the most important part, Lenora said. I know it is. That's why I'm offering it. They went back and forth for another hour working through logistics, the route timing, the holding arrangements at intermediate points, the communication protocol for the drive itself. Prewitt had opinions and she had opinions, and some of them disagreed, and they disagreed about them directly and without drama, and eventually arrived at terms that were better than her initial proposal in 2 respects, and worse in 1, which was close enough to fair that she was willing to take it. At the end, Prewitt sat back and looked at both of them. If this works, he said, and I believe it will work, I want first right of discussion on expanding the cooperative. More ranches, higher volume. There's a national market for reliable, high-quality Texas beef that nobody's organized properly yet. We can discuss that, she said, when it works. He signed the preliminary agreement. She signed it. Colton signed it. Prewitt's clerk witnessed it, and the clerk's hand was shaking slightly, which suggested he understood what kind of document he was witnessing, which suggested Prewitt had briefed him. On the street outside afterward, in the noise and smell of Fort Worth, Colton stood beside her and said, "That went well." "It went well," she agreed. "You didn't tell me about the processing capacity question, that you were going to turn it back to him." "I didn't know I was going to until he asked it." Colton looked at her sidelong. "You're comfortable with improvising." "I'm comfortable with listening," she said. "The improvising follows from that." He was quiet for a moment. They started walking toward where they'd left the horses. The street was loud and busy around them, freighters and merchants and cattle hands and the ordinary commerce of a city that ran on beef. "My father would have liked you," Colton said. It came out quietly, not quite planned, and she could tell from the way he said it that he hadn't intended to say it, which made it the most honest thing he'd said to her since they'd met. She didn't know what to do with it. She wasn't practiced at receiving things like that from him. So she said, "Tell me about him sometime," and left it at that, and they walked back to the horses in the complicated, almost comfortable silence that had become, she realized, their particular version of closeness. 1. Thomas Mast came in. That was the first good news when they got back. Clara Mast had apparently had a conversation with her husband that Lenora would have paid money to hear, because Thomas Mast, who had said almost nothing to her at the Craddock gathering, showed up at the Voss Ranch on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and a look on his face like a man who had been persuaded of something and wasn't entirely sure how. "My wife thinks this is a good idea," he said. "Your wife is right," Lenora said. He sat down at her table, the study room table, which had now seen more significant conversations than any other surface on the property, and she showed him the Prewitt agreement and the route maps and the cost projections, and he went through them the way a man goes through something he's looking for a reason to say no to, but can't quite find one. When he got to the per hundredweight comparison between Prewitt's offer and the syndicate's new rate, he made a sound that was not quite a word. "That's the number," she said. "That's the number," he agreed. He looked up. "Bellew won't come in. He's Craddock's man, always has been." "I know. But I can think of 2 smaller operations that might. The Reyes family, south of here. And old Dunmore. He's been getting squeezed by the syndicate for years, and he's got less patience for it than most." She wrote both names in her notebook. "Can you approach them?" "I can talk to them." He put his hat back on, which apparently meant the conversation was over. "You understand if Peck gets wind of this before the cattle are at Prewitt's yard, he'll try to stop it." "He'll try," she said. Mast looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "My wife said you were formidable," he said. "I told her she was probably exaggerating. What do you think now?" He stood up. "I think Clara's usually right about people," he said, and left. Colton, who had been leaning in the doorway during the second half of this exchange, came in and sat down after Mast's wagon had cleared the yard. "Reyes and Dunmore," he said. "Combined with what we have and what Mast brings in, we're looking at close to 400 head for the first drive." She turned the notebook toward him. "That's within Prewitt's range and enough volume to make the per-animal drive costs work out." He leaned over the numbers. She'd gotten used to this, him leaning over her table, close enough that she was aware of him in the specific way she was usually careful not to dwell on. She kept her attention on the notebook. "What's your timeline?" he said. 6 weeks to get the herd's condition ready for a long drive. The Callahan route adds 4 days, so we need to plan for a 12 to 14-day drive total. That puts delivery in late May, which is good market timing. She paused. We need to move fast and we need to move quiet. If Peck finds out before we're past the county line, he'll find out, Colton said. He's got people everywhere. The question is when. I know. The best case is he finds out when we're already halfway to Fort Worth and it's too late to stop us cleanly. She looked at him. The worst case is he finds out now or next week and has time to organize. Organize how? I don't know exactly. Pressure on the ranchers participating, legal challenges to the route, physical interference with the drive. She kept her voice steady. He's done it before to people who tried to go around him. I've been collecting accounts. Colton was very quiet for a moment. You've been collecting accounts? He said. Since January. He sat back. Lenora. I know. You've been running this investigation for 6 months and you haven't... He stopped himself, ran a hand across his jaw. I'm not angry, he said. I just want to understand. Why didn't you tell me? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I wasn't sure you'd let me keep going if you knew how much I knew, she said. And I needed to keep going. He looked at her for a long time. Something moved across his face, frustration and something else, something older and more complicated. I'm not that man, he said finally. I'm not the kind of man who tells his wife what she can and can't investigate. I know that now, she said. I didn't know it then. He accepted this, which was one of the things she'd come to value about him. He could take an honest answer without making it into a wound. All right, he said. What do the accounts tell you? The Peck's pattern, when he moves against someone, is to work through intermediaries. He doesn't get his own hands dirty. He uses bought sheriffs, hired men, local ranchers with debts to him. If he hears about the drive, he'll put pressure on the weakest link in the cooperative, the rancher he thinks is most likely to fold, and try to break it from the inside. Mast? No. Mast is committed, and he's got Clara's resolve behind him. She turned a page in the notebook to the accounts she'd assembled. If Reyes and Dunmore come in, Dunmore is the vulnerability. He's older, he's had trouble with Peck before, and the history isn't good. So we protect Dunmore. We protect Dunmore. And we don't tell anyone outside the cooperative about the drive until the cattle are moving. Colton nodded slowly. Then, you said Peck uses hired men. Yes. Draper left here angry. He'd been with this ranch for 6 years and he knew our operation better than anyone except me. She met his eyes. I know. You think he went to Peck? I think it's possible. I think we have to assume it's possible and plan accordingly. Colton was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up. I need to ride out and check the north herd, he said, which was what he said when he needed to think and couldn't do it sitting still. He got to the doorway and stopped. Lenora. She looked up. The next time you're building something, he said, tell me while you're building it, not after. All right, she said. He left. She turned back to her notebook. Outside, the spring had finally, tentatively, started to ease the drought. There had been 2 rain events in the past 3 weeks. Not enough to undo the damage, but enough to let the grass begin coming back in the south pasture. She looked at the window for a moment, at the pale Texas sky with its high, thin clouds. Then she kept working. The trouble came on a Thursday night, 16 days before the planned start of the drive. She woke to the sound of horses. Not 1 or 2, but several, moving fast in the yard. And she was out of bed and at the window before she was fully conscious of having moved. Torchlight. 4 riders, maybe 5, moving along the fence line of the south pasture. She grabbed her coat and her boots and was in the hallway when Colton came out of his room, already dressed, which meant he'd heard it first. Stay inside, he said. No, she said. He looked at her. There wasn't time to argue about it. He went for his rifle and she followed him to the door. By the time they got to the porch, 2 of the hands, the Marsh boys, who slept nearest the bunkhouse door, were already in the yard with lanterns. The riders were at the far end of the south fence, and in the torchlight she could see what they were doing, not cutting fence this time, setting fire to it. The wooden posts along the southern line were burning, and the fire was catching the dry grass at the fence line in a way that sent a cold shot through her chest, because if the wind shifted and the south pasture caught— "Get the water barrels on the wagon," Colton said to the Marsh boys, already moving. "Burke! Burke! Get up!" The riders saw them coming and didn't wait. They were gone before anyone got close enough to identify them, which was clearly the intention. Do the damage, leave, be somewhere else with an alibi before dawn. She watched them go and memorized what she could. One dark horse with a distinctive high-stepping gait. One rider heavier than the others, the direction they took, which was northwest toward Craddock's land, though that meant nothing necessarily. She turned and ran back to the house and got 2 buckets from the kitchen and went to the well and was filling them when Burke passed her at a dead run. "I've got it, ma'am." "You've got the wagon," she said. "I've got these." She carried water for an hour and a half alongside the hands and Colton, and the fire at the fence line went out without reaching the pasture, which was the only good thing about the night. 3 fence posts burned through, 40 feet of wire down. The south pasture untouched, but the smell of smoke hanging over everything in the still air. Afterward, Colton stood at the edge of the damage with a lantern in his hand, and she stood beside him, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Peck," she said finally. "Or someone who wanted it to look like it was random," he said, "which amounts to the same thing. He knows. He knows something." Colton looked at the burned posts. "Maybe not the whole plan. Maybe just that we're talking to people, considering options." "That's enough for him to move on." "Yes." He was quiet. Then, "The drive moves up." She looked at him. "By how much?" "A week. Can it be done?" She thought through it. The herds weren't quite where she wanted them condition-wise, but they were close. The rains had helped, and close was going to have to be good enough. Prewitt could be contacted by telegraph. She'd gotten his telegraph address at the meeting. The route hands she and Colton had quietly hired over the past month were ready. 2 men named Ferris and Cole, who had driven cattle to Kansas and knew long drives the way she knew breeding records. The cooperative ranchers were as ready as they were going to be. "It can be done," she said. He nodded. "Then we start in 4 days. Not 7. 4. He looked at her. "Telegraph Prewitt in the morning." "I will." She looked at the burned fence line. "Colton? He's going to come harder than this." "I know." "When the drive starts moving, he'll know it within a day. He'll try to intercept." "I know that too." He turned from the fence. "That's why you're not going on the drive." She turned to look at him directly. "I'm going on the drive." "Lenora, the Prewitt contract has my signature on it. The route is in my notebook. Every logistics decision, every contingency is in my head. If something goes wrong on the trail, you need me there to adapt it, not sending a message back to the ranch and waiting for an answer." She held his gaze. "You know I'm right." He looked at her for a long time in the lantern light, with smoke still in the air around them, and she watched him work through it. The objections, the practical reality of the objections, the practical reality of her argument against them. "You ride your own horse," he said finally. "Not the wagon." "Obviously," she said. He walked back toward the house. She stood for another moment at the burned fence line, looking at the char marks on the ground, thinking about what was coming. The morning they moved out was gray and cool, which was better weather for cattle than sunshine, and she was grateful for it in the specific way you're grateful for small advantages when large problems are bearing down. 411 head, combined from the Voss, Mast, Reyes, and Dunmore operations. 11 trail hands including Ferris and Cole, the Marsh boys, Burke, and a man named Hector who had worked for the Reyes family for 20 years and had a calm competence about him that she found reassuring. Colton rode point. She rode flank on the right side, which Ferris had told her was the harder flank on the Callahan route because of the terrain, which was why he'd suggested it and why she'd accepted without comment. Mast rode with them for the first day, then turned back to manage his home operation. He shook Lenora's hand before he went, which was different from the hat-in-hand meeting 2 months earlier. "Bring them home safe," he said, meaning the cattle. "That's the intention," she said. The first 3 days were hard in the ordinary ways. Cattle that didn't want to move in the morning, dust that got into everything, a river crossing on day 2 that cost them 3 hours and 1 animal, which was one more than she'd budgeted for in losses. Ferris and Cole were worth every cent she'd negotiated to pay them. They read the herd the way she read her notebooks, constantly, with an instinct built from years of watching cattle in motion. She slept on the ground, which she had known she would do and had prepared for, though knowing and doing were different things. The first morning she woke with her hip bones aching from the hard earth and her back stiff in a way it took an hour of riding to work out. By the 4th day, her body had adjusted mostly. By the 6th day, she'd stopped noticing. The message reached them on day 5. One of Dunmore's hands had fallen back from the herd that afternoon, and she noticed because she noticed when the count in her section was off. She rode back to find him talking to a rider she didn't recognize, a man on a gray horse who was doing most of the talking, and who saw her coming and didn't wait, just turned the gray around and headed back south at a canter. She rode up to Dunmore's hand, a young man named Ket. Who was that? Ket was 17 years old and not a good liar. Nobody. Just a rider. Ket. He looked at his saddle horn. Man from Delwood. Said Mr. Dunmore has a debt situation that Mr. Peck is prepared to call in if the drive doesn't turn back. She kept her voice flat. What did you tell him? Nothing. I didn't know what to say. You said nothing, and you came back to the herd. That's exactly right. She looked at him until he met her eyes. Go tell Mr. Ferris I need to speak with him. Don't say what about. She rode to the front and told Colton. He listened without expression. Dunmore knows about this? Not yet. Ket didn't have time to get to him before I intervened. We need to tell him. Yes, but not in front of anyone else. She looked ahead at the herd moving in the gray afternoon light, the dust rising in a long, low cloud. If Dunmore pulls out now, we lose nearly 100 head from our count, and the per animal economics get a lot tighter. Can it still work? She'd been doing the math in her head since the moment Ket told her. Barely. Not comfortably. We'd need Prewitt's price to hold exactly, and we'd need no more losses. She paused. It's not where I want to be. So we keep Dunmore. We give him a reason to stay that's stronger than the reason to go. She thought for a moment. What do you know about his debt situation? Some. His wife's medical expenses a few years back. Peck extended him credit at an ugly rate. What's the amount? I don't know exactly. Thousands. She was quiet for a moment. If we guaranteed his share of the Prewitt payment against his debt, put it in writing, signed by us tonight, would that be enough? Colton looked at her. That's our capital you're talking about pledging. I know. If the drive fails, we're already in a bad position. This doesn't change that significantly. She met his eyes. It keeps Dunmore. And keeping Dunmore keeps the numbers. He rode for a while without answering. The herd moved around them, the sound of it, hooves and breath, and the low constant sound of cattle in motion, filling the space between them. All right, he said. We tell him tonight at camp. They told him at the fire, the 3 of them slightly apart from the hands. Dunmore was 64 years old, weathered to something almost architectural, and he listened to the account of what Ket had been told with his jaw set and his eyes on the fire. Peck doesn't bluff about debt, he said. No, Colton said, but we're not asking you to ignore the debt. We're asking you to stay through the delivery and use your payment to address it. And if the delivery falls through, then we cover your position, Lenora said. This is the guarantee. She handed him the paper she'd written at sunset, by the last light, using the flat of her saddle as a desk. It wasn't much to look at. 3 sentences, ink slightly smeared from the speed she'd written it. But it said what it said, and she'd signed it, and Colton had signed it. Dunmore took it and read it, read it again. He was quiet for a long time. My wife thought I was making a mistake when I agreed to this drive, he said. What do you think? Lenora said. He looked at her. I think a woman who signs a paper like this at a campfire in the middle of a cattle drive is either crazy or certain. I'm certain of the math, she said. The rest is uncertainty I'm choosing to run toward, rather than away from. He looked at the paper once more, folded it, put it in his coat pocket. I'll stay, he said. She let herself breathe. The real threat came on day 9. They were 2 days out from Fort Worth, moving through a narrow corridor of land between 2 sets of hills, when Ferris rode back fast from the point position and said, without preamble, 3 riders on the ridge to the east. Been there an hour, not moving. Colton looked at the ridge. She looked at it. 3 figures, stationary, watching. They're not drovers, Cole said. He'd come up behind Ferris. Wrong horses, wrong posture. They're not going to do anything in daylight with 11 of us, Colton said. It's tonight I'm worried about. If they spook the herd at night, Ferris said, and didn't finish the sentence because he didn't have to. A spooked herd in unfamiliar terrain at night was a kind of loss you didn't fully recover from. She looked at the ridge, thought about the terrain she'd scouted months ago, riding it alone, which felt like a different lifetime. There was a fork in the route 2 miles ahead, the main branch of the Callahan approach, and an older, less used spur that cut west through rougher country before rejoining the main route 12 miles on. The west spur, she said. Ferris looked at her. That's rough country. Rougher for cattle, but if those riders are planning to hit us tonight, they'll hit us on the main route because that's what I scouted, and... She stopped. Colton looked at her. Draper, she said quietly. He knew I scouted the routes. He'd have told Peck which route. But he didn't know about the west spur, Colton said, following it. I didn't ride the west spur when I scouted. It was in worse condition. She turned to Ferris. How much harder for the cattle? Ferris thought. Extra half day. Rougher footing. We'd need to move slow. Can we do it overnight? Move them onto the spur before those riders can reposition? Ferris looked at Cole. Some communication passed between 2 men who had worked together for years. We can try, Cole said. It won't be pretty. It doesn't need to be pretty, she said. It needs to work. They moved the herd onto the west spur at dusk. It was the worst 6 hours of the drive. Rocky ground, a cattle population that had no interest in the change of direction. 2 animals that turned stubborn in a creek crossing and had to be individually persuaded by Burke and Hector while the rest of the herd milled and complained. She rode hard for all of it, back and forth along the flank, talking to the cattle in a low, constant murmur that she'd discovered worked better than shouting, following Ferris's lead and Cole's, learning as she went because there was no option other than learning as she went. At 2 in the morning, they cleared the worst of the terrain, and she pulled up on a rise and looked back at the herd moving in the pale dark, and she counted. 408. 3 animals lost on the spur, 2 of them the stubborn ones from the creek crossing that had finally turned back in the dark. Better than she'd feared. Colton came up beside her. He was dust-covered and tired in the specific way that tired lives in the eyes. She was probably worse. West spur's behind us, he said. Yes. Main route rejoins in about 12 miles. Yes. He looked out at the herd. Lenora. That was... He paused, searching for the right word the way he sometimes did, taking his time with it. Don't say brilliant, she said. We lost 3 animals, and it took 6 hours. I was going to say right, he said. It was the right call. She looked at the herd moving below them in the dark, 408 animals that were 2 days away from a contract that was going to change what was possible for every rancher in their county. Ask me when we get to Fort Worth, she said. He almost smiled. She saw it in the dark, just barely, and it was the realest thing she'd seen on his face since she'd known him. They rode down off the rise and back to the herd. Fort Worth received them on a Tuesday morning with overcast skies and the smell of rain coming, which Ferris said was good luck for a drive's end, and Cole said was just weather, and the argument between them carried the last 2 miles into the stockyard approach with the comfortable rhythm of 2 men who had been disagreeing about small things for years. Prewitt was at the yard when they arrived. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected a foreman, a receiving clerk, someone representing him. But he was there himself, standing at the gate in his shirt sleeves despite the cool air, and when the lead animals came through the chute, he started counting with the practiced eye of a man who had been doing this since he was young, and he didn't stop until the last animal was through. 406. They'd lost 2 more on the final day, both older animals that had simply given out on the last push, which hurt, but was within the range she'd calculated for. Prewitt walked the pens. She walked with him. He looked at the cattle with the expression of a man who is pleasantly surprised and is trying not to show it too obviously, which she appreciated because it meant she had room to negotiate from a position of having delivered better than expected. "Conditions good," he said. "Better than I'd have thought for a 14-day drive." 13 and a half, she said. He almost smiled. "The weight's where it needs to be. Maybe 2% below what the contract specified, which is within tolerance." He stopped at a pen holding a group of the better-bred animals, the offspring of the one strong bull Colton had been running, the ones that showed in their bone structure and weight distribution what the herd could be if the genetics were taken seriously. "These are different from the others. Different breeding line," she said. "What we're working toward expanding. These are what you'd be delivering if you had a proper crossbreeding program in place. These, and better." He looked at them for another moment. "We should talk about the second drive." "We should talk about payment for the first one," she said. "Then the second drive." He laughed, a short, genuine sound. "Fair enough." The settlement took 3 hours in his office, going through the count and the weight certificates and the contract terms line by line. She did most of the talking on their side, with Colton beside her, and what she noticed was that somewhere in the 13 and a half days on the trail, she had stopped being aware of Colton as separate from herself in these negotiations. They had become, without formally deciding to, a unit. She spoke and he confirmed, he pushed back on something and she refined it. They exchanged looks across the table that carried information that would have taken paragraphs to write out. Prewitt noticed too. She could see him noticing in the way he addressed them equally, which was different from how most men in a room addressed a rancher and his wife. The final payment figure, when Prewitt's clerk wrote it out, was not transformative. She had to be honest with herself about that. It was better than the syndicate's rate by the margin she'd projected, and after drive costs and the hands' wages and the guaranteed payment she'd committed to for Dunmore's debt position, what remained for the Voss operation was enough to breathe with, enough to make the next decision from a position of having options rather than desperation. It was not enough to call themselves safe. It was enough to call themselves viable, which was different from where they'd been 6 months ago, and which was what she'd been working toward. She divided the cooperative payments on the spot, with Prewitt's clerk witnessing. Mast's portion, Reyes's, Dunmore's, minus the guaranteed amount she'd committed to, which left him clear of his PEC debt with a small remainder. Dunmore took his envelope and held it in both hands for a moment without opening it. He was a man who did not show things easily, 64 years of weather and difficulty having installed in him a particular resistance to visible emotion, but she saw his throat move. "Thank you," he said to her. "You stayed the drive," she said. "That's what did it." He shook his head slightly, which meant he disagreed but wasn't going to argue about it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. On the street afterward, with the Fort Worth noise around them and the smell of rain still coming from the west, Colton stood beside her and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "We need to talk about what's next." "I know." "Not tonight. Tonight we sleep in actual beds." He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had on the rise above the herd 2 nights ago. "You look like 13 days on a cattle drive." "So do you." "I've done it before. It suits me." He paused. "It suits you too, it turns out." She didn't know what to do with that either, so she said, "Hotel's on the next block," and started walking, and he fell into step beside her. And that was that. The news about the drive reached Delwood before they did. She didn't know how. Word moves faster than cattle through certain kinds of country, carried by traders and freighters, and the telegraph line and the particular efficiency of people who make it their business to know things. By the time they rode back into the county 3 days after settlement, the story was already there, in some version. She knew because the first person she saw in Delwood, stopping to pick up mail at the post office, was Mrs. Garfield, who looked at her across the counter with an expression that was trying to sort itself between several emotions and hadn't quite settled on one. "I heard you drove cattle to Fort Worth," Mrs. Garfield said. "We did." "Outside the syndicate?" "Yes." Mrs. Garfield was quiet for a moment. Harlan Peck was in here yesterday. He didn't look well. Lenora took her mail. I hope he feels better, she said, which was not entirely sincere, and went back to her horse. The ranch was as she'd left it. The Marsh boys had held things together. The herd that had stayed home was in reasonable shape. The south pasture grass was coming back with more confidence now that the drought had broken. She walked through it the first morning back and made notes in her notebook, the way she always did. But the notes felt different, less like charting the dimensions of a problem and more like taking inventory of something she was building. The letters started arriving the following week. First, a note from Thomas Mast, brief and to the point. His wife thought they should discuss the second drive before summer. Then a longer letter from the Reyes family's eldest son, who apparently handled their correspondence, asking whether the cooperative structure could accommodate a larger volume commitment from their operation. Then, most surprisingly, a letter from a rancher named Howell, whom she'd never met, who ran an operation 2 counties east and who had heard, he didn't say from whom, about the direct Fort Worth arrangement, and who wanted to understand how it worked. She answered all of them. She answered them carefully and in detail, and she kept copies of every response in her notebook, which was now the second notebook, the first one having been filled sometime during the drive. She also wrote to Dr. Whitfield at the Agricultural College, who had responded to her earlier letter with interest, about the Durham Cross bulls. His letter had been waiting when she got back. 2 pages of technical detail and enthusiasm that she read 3 times before she fully absorbed it. There were 2 bulls available, he said, from a program he'd been running, both of them young enough to be productive for years and with a documented genetic history he could provide. The price was high, but not impossible. She showed the letter to Colton over dinner. He read it again, looked up. This is the breeding program. Yes. We can't afford both. We can afford one, she said. With what's left after expenses from the Fort Worth payment, we can afford one. The second one we defer until the fall drive. Fall drive, he said. It wasn't a question exactly. He was testing the phrase, seeing how it sat. If we do a second drive in the fall with expanded volume, Howell's operation, if they come in, plus expanded commitments from Mast and Reyes, we'll have the capital for the second bull before winter. She turned her notebook so he could see the projection page. And with 2 good bulls running and a full breeding season, we're looking at a meaningfully different herd in 2 years. He looked at the numbers for a while. She'd gotten used to the rhythm of this. Him reading, her waiting, the silence not uncomfortable but active, both of them thinking. The Howell letter, he said. You don't know this man. No, but his reputation is solid. I've asked around, quietly. He's not a Craddock man and he's not in debt to Peck. 2 counties east means a longer drive for his animals to reach the assembly point. I've mapped it. It adds a day to the overall drive, within tolerance. He turned another page, looked at something, turned it back. Lenora. How long have you been planning the fall drive? She considered being evasive and decided not to. Since before we left for Fort Worth. He put the notebook down and looked at her across the table, and she waited for, she wasn't sure what. Frustration, maybe. He had told her that night at the burned fence line to tell him while she was building things. But what she saw on his face wasn't frustration. It was something that looked more like, wonder wasn't quite the right word, but it was in the direction of wonder. The expression of a man who keeps finding something larger than he expected every time he looks closely. All right, he said. All right? Write to Howell. Set up a meeting. He closed the notebook and pushed it back toward her. And get the bull from Whitfield. One now, one in the fall. She looked at him. You're sure? You've been sure since January, he said. It's taken me this long to catch up. Something in that landed in a place she hadn't known was waiting for something to land in it. She looked down at her notebook and then back up at him and said carefully, We're going to need a better system for tracking the breeding records if we're expanding the program. I'll need your help with that. You know the individual animals better than I do. It was a small thing to say, but it was also true, and saying it was its own kind of offer. An acknowledgement that what she knew and what he knew were different, and that different was the point. He accepted it the same way she'd learned he accepted most things, without ceremony. "Show me what you need," he said. Harlan Peck made his move in July. She had expected something. The fire at the fence line had been a warning, and the riders on the ridge during the drive had been an escalation, and the pressure on Dunmore had been a probe looking for a weak point. Men like Peck didn't stop when the first strategy failed. They recalibrated and came back through a different door. The door he chose was legal. A letter arrived from a lawyer in Austin. Not Peck's name on it anywhere, but she recognized the shape of it immediately. A claim that the Callahan County route the drive had used passed through land that was subject to a grazing rights agreement with the Western Beef Syndicate, and that the use of that route without syndicate permission constituted a violation of that agreement, and that damages were being sought. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and went to her bookshelf and pulled out a land title document she had obtained, in a fit of thoroughness she hadn't been entirely sure she'd need, from the county clerk's office in March. She'd requested title records for every parcel within a half-mile of the West Spur route, which at the time had felt like excessive caution and now felt like the most important thing she'd ever done. She laid the title document alongside the lawyer's letter and compared them for 20 minutes. Then she made notes. Then she made more notes. When Colton came in from the afternoon's work, she was still at the table, surrounded by papers. "Peck," she said, without looking up. "He's claiming grazing rights on the Callahan route." She heard him stop walking. "Is the claim valid?" "On the main Callahan route, possibly. He's got an agreement that could be interpreted broadly enough to cover it." She looked up. "We didn't use the main route." He came to the table and she showed him the documents side by side. "The West Spur," he said. "The West Spur runs through parcels that changed hands in 1879 after the syndicate's agreement was signed. The new owners never entered into any grazing rights arrangement with Peck." She tapped the title document. "The claim is technically against the main route. We can demonstrate we didn't use the main route. We have 11 trail hands who can attest to the route taken, plus my original maps with dates on them from when I scouted it." Colton was quiet for a moment. "He might not know we switched to the West Spur." "He doesn't. His riders were watching the main route approach. By the time they figured out we'd gone west, we were already past the point that mattered." She set the letter down. "This claim is going to fail if we respond correctly, but it'll cost us in legal fees and time, which is probably part of the point. Can we respond ourselves, or do we need a lawyer?" "We need a lawyer for the filing, but I can write the response brief, what the facts are and what the law is, and any competent lawyer can put it into proper form from that." She paused. "I wrote to a man in Austin this morning, someone Prewitt recommended. He's responded to syndicate legal maneuvers before." Colton sat down heavily in the chair across from her, not from defeat, from the particular tiredness of a man who has been in a long fight and knows it isn't over. "He's not going to stop," he said. "No, but he's running out of effective moves." She turned a page in the notebook to a section she'd put together in the past week. "The legal claim is weak, and he knows it. It's delay, not resolution. His physical intimidation failed on the drive. His attempt to break the cooperative through Dunmore failed." She looked at the page. "The syndicate's actual leverage is controlling the processing houses, but that leverage only works if we need the processing houses he controls. Every drive we complete to Fort Worth, every rancher who joins the cooperative, reduces how much we need them." Colton looked at her. "You've been mapping his options." "I've been mapping his weaknesses. It's the same thing, eventually." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the July evening was coming in warm and the cicadas had started their noise, which she had grown accustomed to in a way she hadn't expected. The sound of Texas evening, which was different from any evening sound she'd known before. "When did you stop being afraid of him?" Colton asked. She thought about it honestly. "I'm not sure I was ever afraid of him specifically. I was afraid of failing, of bringing the whole thing down through a mistake or something I hadn't thought of." She paused. "I still am, but it's a working fear. It makes me think harder rather than think less." He looked at her across the table in the evening light with the papers spread between them. "My father was afraid of Peck," he said. "Not obviously. He didn't talk about it. But he gave the syndicate whatever they asked for because somewhere in him he believed they were more powerful than the alternative. He was quiet for a moment. I believed it too. Until you showed me the alternative had arithmetic. She didn't say anything for a moment. The cicadas went on outside. He built this ranch, she said. Your father. He held it together through things I don't fully know about. He did. That's not a small thing. No, he agreed. It's not. It was the most they'd said about his father in 8 months of marriage. She didn't push further. There were things in Colton Voss that were still closed to her, rooms she hadn't been invited into, and she'd learned to respect that, not because she'd stopped being curious, but because she'd learned that some doors open on their own schedule. The Austin lawyer responded within the week. His assessment matched hers on the legal merits, and he added 2 points of case law she hadn't had access to that made the position even stronger. The legal response went out in early August. By September, Peck's lawyer had not replied, which the Austin lawyer said was the reply. A man who believed in his claim responds to it, and a man who filed it to create trouble goes quiet when the trouble doesn't take. Curtis Craddock came to the ranch in August, which she had not anticipated. He came alone, without his usual entourage of foreman and opinion, on a Wednesday afternoon when Colton was in the south pasture, and she was the one who came to the porch when she heard a horse in the yard. She stood on the top step and watched him ride up and dismount, and she waited. He stood at the bottom of the steps with his hat in his hands. The same posture Mast had used, she noticed, though on Craddock it looked like it cost more. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Mr. Craddock." He looked around the yard, at the repairs that had been made since winter, at the new fence posts along the south line, at the bull, the Durham Cross from Whitfield, who had arrived in June and was already causing a visible stir of interest among the Voss cows, standing in the near pasture with the authority of an animal that knew its own value. "That's a fine animal," Craddock said. "He is." Craddock looked at his hat. "I've been hearing things," he said, "about the Fort Worth arrangement, about what Prewitt's paying." She said nothing. "And I've been hearing that you're putting together a second drive for the fall, bigger volume." "We're discussing it," she said. He looked up from his hat. He had the look of a man who has been practicing something in his head and is now finding the actual conversation harder than the rehearsed version. "I was rude to you," he said, "at my gathering, in February." She waited. "I said this isn't arithmetic, it's ranching." He said it like a man quoting something he wished he hadn't said. "That was a stupid thing to say." "It was," she agreed, because she didn't see any value in pretending otherwise. Something moved across his face that might have been a suppressed reaction and might have been respect. "I've got 450 head that I'd like to include in the fall drive," he said, "if the cooperative is open to additional members." She looked at him for a long moment. Curtis Craddock, who had dismissed her in front of every rancher in the county, who had used the word realistic like a door closing, was standing at the bottom of her porch steps asking to join the thing she'd built. She thought about what to say and decided on the honest thing. "The cooperative isn't a charity, and it isn't a favor," she said. "There's a financial commitment to make the drive work, and there are obligations to the other members. If your animals don't meet the weight and condition standards, they don't go." Craddock nodded slowly. "Understood. And if Peck approaches you, which he may, if he knows you've joined, you hold. You don't make separate arrangements with him, and you don't give him information about the drive. That's not optional." "I understand that too." She looked at him for another moment, this man who had made her feel invisible in his front room 6 months ago, and she found that she didn't want to punish him for it. Punishing him wouldn't build anything. It would just be satisfying, which was different. "Come back on Friday," she said. "Bring your breeding records and your current weight estimates. We'll see if the numbers work." He put his hat back on, nodded once, turned and remounted and rode back down the yard road. She was still on the porch when Colton came around from the south pasture an hour later and saw her standing there. "What happened?" he said. "Craddock came by." He stopped walking. "And?" "He wants to join the fall drive." Colton looked at her. "You're serious?" He apologized first, adequately, I thought. She turned to go back inside. "He's coming Friday with his records." Colton stood in the yard for a moment, clearly processing this. Then he said, "You're not going to enjoy that you were right." She stopped at the door. "Of course I am," she said. "I'm going to enjoy it exactly as much as is appropriate, and not one bit more." He made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, a short one, almost surprised out of him. She hadn't heard that before. She'd seen the almost smile in the dark on the drive, but not this. It changed his face in a way that was worth seeing. She went inside before she let herself dwell on that. The fall drive was harder than the spring one, and better than it in almost every way. 640 head. 4 ranches plus the Voss operation, with Craddock's animals making the difference in volume. Ferris and Cole back, plus 3 additional hands hired on Ferris's recommendation. The Callahan route, again. The West Spur had been improved somewhat by their first passage, and Ferris knew it now, which made it faster. 17 days total. She rode flank again. Colton rode point and swing both, moving up and back the way a man does when he understands the whole animal of a cattle drive, how it breathes and shifts and where the pressure points are. She watched him work and saw things she hadn't seen in the spring, not because he'd changed, but because she'd learned enough to see what had always been there. He was exceptionally good at this. The physical management of large animals in difficult terrain, the reading of weather and land and the mood of a herd, the specific leadership required when you had a dozen men in hard conditions with competing opinions and genuine danger. He was quiet about it, which was his way, but it was real. She told him so on day 11, on a quiet stretch of trail in the late afternoon, when they were riding parallel for a few minutes, with no particular crisis demanding attention. "You're good at this," she said. "The drive, the management of it." He glanced at her. "It's what I grew up doing." "That's not why you're good at it. Plenty of people grow up doing something and are only adequate at it." She kept her eyes on the herd. "You read the whole situation at once, the cattle, the terrain, the men. Most people can only hold 2 of the 3. He was quiet for a moment. "You hold all 3. "I hold different 3, she said. "The economics, the logistics, the relationships. You hold the physical ones. That's why—" She paused, not sure how to finish the sentence. "Why what?" he said. "Why it works," she said. "The 2 of us. Why it works better than either of us alone." She hadn't meant to say it that directly. It was the kind of thing she usually said to herself in the careful, private space of her notebook, and not out loud. But it was true, and she'd said it, and she looked ahead at the herd and waited to see what he'd do with it. He rode for a while. The land around them was afternoon gold, the dust of the herd hanging in the light. "Yes," he said, "just that." She let herself feel it this time. Didn't redirect it or file it away for later examination. Just let it be what it was, which was something she'd been building toward for 8 months without knowing for certain she was building toward it, the way you sometimes don't know what you're making until it's close to finished. Fort Worth the second time felt different. Prewitt at the gate again, but this time he brought 2 associates she hadn't met, because the volume warranted it. The count was 621, 19 animals lost on 17 days, which was within range for a drive this size and these conditions. The weights were better than the spring drive because the breeding program had started showing results even in one season. The first-generation crossbreeds were heavier at comparable age. Prewitt saw it immediately. He stood in the pen with a measuring eye on a group of the better animals and said, "These are what you were talking about, the breeding program." "First season," she said. 2 years from now, if the second bull is running by spring, you'll see the full effect." "What kind of weight gain are we talking?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment, doing arithmetic in his head, and then he said, "Mrs. Voss, I want to have a different conversation about next year, not just volume and price. Structure." "What kind of structure?" "Exclusive arrangement. I take everything the cooperative produces at a guaranteed price for 3 years. You guarantee me the volume and the quality standards. We grow together." He paused. "I'm also talking to a processing investor in Chicago who's looking to establish a Texas operation. If that goes through, we'd be looking at on-site processing capacity here in Fort Worth, which changes the economics for everyone significantly." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Colton, who had come up beside her. He met her eyes briefly, a question in it, and also a deferring, in the specific way he'd been doing since the fall drive started. Giving her the lead on the commercial conversations, not because he wasn't capable, but because he'd recognized that this was the territory she understood best, and that recognition was its own kind of trust. 3 years is a long commitment, she said to Prewitt. It is. The price guarantee compensates for that. I'll want the Chicago investor arrangement in writing before we sign anything. If that falls through, the exclusive arrangement costs us options we don't get back. Prewitt nodded. That's fair. And the quality standards need to be defined by us, not by you, based on our breeding program, not on historical market averages. He looked at her. You're asking me to let the supplier set the quality bar. I'm telling you the quality bar is going to be higher than market average by the time we're at scale, so you can either write the contract around what we're actually building, or you can write it around historical averages and renegotiate in 2 years. She paused. Renegotiating costs both of us time. Prewitt looked at her for a long moment. Then he said to no one in particular, I should have come to Texas years ago. The settlement for the fall drive, when the clerk wrote it out, was a number that didn't need arithmetic to understand. It was the kind of number that changed the shape of things. Not just the ranch's balance sheet, but the shape of what was possible, what could be decided, what could be built. She sat with it for a moment in Prewitt's office, the paper in front of her, and thought about the first morning she'd arrived at the Voss Ranch in a slightly squashed hat, standing in the yard while men laughed quietly behind her. She didn't dwell on it. Dwelling wasn't useful, but she let herself know it had happened, the distance between that moment and this one, and she let herself feel the weight of what it had taken to cover it. Colton was watching her. All right, he said. Yes, she said. She picked up the pen and signed the settlement document. All right. Outside on the Fort Worth street afterward, with the noise of the city and the smell of the stockyards and the late fall air coming in cold from the north, they stood together and she thought about the ranch waiting for them and the breeding records, and the third notebook she'd already started, and the 3-year arrangement that was going to be the foundation of something larger than either of them had said out loud yet. Colton put his hand on her arm. Just briefly, just a moment, the particular gesture of a man who is not practiced at gestures and is doing it anyway because something in him has decided it's the right time. She didn't move away from it. She looked at the street ahead, at the ordinary movement of the city around them, and she stood where she was and let the moment be what it was. Let's go home, she said. They did. The Chicago investor's name was Bernard Callow, and he arrived in Fort Worth in the spring of the following year with 3 associates and a leather satchel full of financial documents and the specific energy of a man who had made significant money by arriving somewhere just before everyone else realized they should be there too. Prewitt brought him to meet her and Colton at the stockyard office on a Tuesday morning, and Callow shook Colton's hand first, which she noted without reacting to, and then shook hers, and then looked around the room with the bright, acquisitive attention of a man taking inventory. I've been reading about your operation, he said to her. Prewitt sent me 3 reports. I hope they were accurate, she said, accurate enough to bring me here from Chicago in April. He sat down without being asked, which told her something about him. Not arrogance exactly, but the assumption of welcome that came from having been welcomed everywhere for long enough that it became a reflex. The processing facility is real. We're prepared to invest. The question is structure. The question is always structure, she said, and sat down across from him. They talked for 4 hours. Callow was sharp in the way that money makes people sharp. Not intellectual exactly, but fast. Good at finding the number underneath the conversation. Good at identifying where risk lived and who was being asked to carry it. She matched him on all of it. When he tried to structure the processing arrangement in a way that gave his investment group effective control over pricing decisions, she caught it on the second page of the term sheet and said quietly, "This clause." He looked where she pointed. Standard protective language for the investor. It's not protective language. It's pricing authority dressed as protective language. She looked at him. We can give you return protection through volume guarantees and quality standards. We cannot give you pricing authority because pricing authority is what this entire cooperative was built to take away from people who abused it. Callow looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Pruitt, who gave him the expression of a man who had already had this experience and was not surprised to watch someone else have it. Revise language, Callow said finally. We'll take return protection through volume. Pricing stays with the cooperative. And the quality standards are defined jointly with final determination by the cooperative's breeding committee, she said, which currently consists of myself and Dr. James Whitfield from the Agricultural College, who you're welcome to speak with. Callow wrote something on his copy of the term sheet. You have a breeding committee. We have everything that a serious operation needs to have, she said. That's why you came from Chicago. He looked at her again with that bright inventory attention, and this time what she saw underneath it was something like genuine respect, which was different from the negotiating respect that men showed when they realized they couldn't steamroll someone. This was the other kind. The kind that took a moment to register because it wasn't something she'd been given freely very often. All right, Mrs. Voss, he said, let's build something. The processing facility went up outside Fort Worth over the following 18 months. It was not a smooth 18 months. There were construction delays and a dispute with a local contractor that cost 6 weeks and a significant portion of the contingency budget, and one of the Reyes brothers left the cooperative over a disagreement about vote structure that took 3 painful meetings to resolve and left a scar in the relationship that healed but never fully disappeared, which was the honest truth of what it meant to build something with other people. She managed most of it from the ranch, by telegraph and letter, and occasional trips to Fort Worth, while simultaneously running a breeding program that was now in its 2nd full generation and producing animals that Dr. Whitfield, when he came out in the 2nd autumn to evaluate the herd, described in his careful academic language as a meaningful advancement over regional baseline, which she understood to mean that she'd been right about what was possible. She was 30 years old when the facility opened. She did not think of this as significant, particularly, age was not something she spent time on, but she noticed it because Clara Mast mentioned it at the opening gathering, which Pruitt organized at the Fort Worth yard with more ceremony than she'd expected or entirely wanted. 30 years old and you've done all this, Clara said. She had come up from Delwood for the occasion and she looked at the facility, the long building, the equipment, the organized flow of the operation, with the expression of a woman who had spent 20 years making peace with a wall and was now watching someone else move it. We've done it, Lenore said. There are a lot of names on the cooperative. Don't do that, Claire said. Do what? Distribute the credit so evenly that you disappear from your own story. Clara looked at her directly. You can share the credit honestly and still be in it. Those aren't the same thing. Lenora was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of thing that was easy to dismiss and harder to argue with. All right, she said. Good. Clara picked up a glass from a passing tray. My husband still doesn't fully understand what happened. He knows the numbers are better. He knows Peck is finished. He's not sure how it came to be this way. Peck's not quite finished, Lenora said. He's finished, Clara said flatly. A man who controls a market by controlling the only exit is finished the moment someone builds another exit. You built 5. She thought about the 5 direct buyer relationships the cooperative now maintained. Pruitt and 4 others she'd developed over 2 years. In different cities, creating a network of options that made any single buyer's leverage manageable. She thought about the processing facility, which removed the syndicate's last real point of control. She thought about the legal filing against Peck's grazing rights claim, which had been quietly withdrawn by Peck's lawyer 6 months after it was filed, which was the sound a certain kind of power made when it gave up. He's finished, she agreed. Thus, Colton found her that evening, after the gathering had wound down, and the Fort Worth hotel they were staying in had gone quiet. She was sitting at the small desk in their room, not working exactly. The notebook was open, but she hadn't written anything in an hour, just sitting with the particular stillness that came after a thing you'd been building for a long time was finally built. He came and sat on the edge of the bed behind her and said, "You're not celebrating." "I'm not much of a celebrator. I've noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "You should be, though. Tonight." She turned to look at him. He was still in the good shirt he'd worn for the gathering, jacket off, and he looked tired in the way that was about something more than the day. The accumulated tiredness of 2 years of hard building, which she knew because she felt it in herself too. Clara told me not to disappear from my own story, she said. Clara's right. I know. She turned back to the notebook. It's habit. My whole life I've built things in ways that didn't look like building so that people wouldn't try to stop me before I was done. And now the thing is done, and I still have the habit. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him shift on the bed. You built something that nobody thought was possible, he said. And the reason you were able to build it wasn't just because you were smart. It was because you were willing to be underestimated for as long as it took. She turned to look at him again. I underestimated you, he said. It was direct, without performance, the way he said things when he decided to say them and wasn't going to soften them into something easier. The first year, I wasn't as bad as Draper or Craddock, but I held back in ways that didn't help you. I want you to know I know that. She held his eyes. You also held your word and let me work, and signed the Dunmore guarantee at a campfire at 2 a.m, and learned the breeding records with me, and rode 17 days in the fall without once telling me I'd been wrong about any of it. She paused. It wasn't one-sided, Colton. He accepted this, the way he always did, without using it to feel better than he should, but without refusing it either. He had learned over 2 years that she meant what she said and didn't offer comfort she didn't mean. So when she said something like this, he received it as information. What's in the notebook, he said. She looked down at it. The next thing, she said. Which is? The breeding program needs a formal documentation system that other ranchers can actually use. Right now it's in my notebooks, which works for us but doesn't scale. She turned a page. And Whitfield wants to put together an extension program through the college. Get the crossbreeding methodology out to ranchers who can't afford our bulls directly. I've been thinking about how the cooperative could support that. He looked at her. You finished one thing, and you've already built the next thing in your head. The next 3 things, she said honestly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Show me. She turned the notebook toward him, and he leaned over to look at it, close beside her at the small desk. And she walked him through what she was thinking, the documentation system, the extension program, a longer-term thought about working with Callow's group to fund a second processing facility farther south that would open the market to ranchers in regions that currently had no real option but the syndicate. He asked questions. She answered them. They disagreed about the timeline on the second facility and agreed that the extension program was urgent. It was, she realized, the same conversation they'd been having for 2 years, just further along the road, with more behind them and more ahead. At some point, he stopped asking questions about the notebook and just sat with her, and the conversation became something else, quieter, less structured, the kind of talking that 2 people do when they've stopped performing anything for each other and are just present in the same room. She thought about her father, briefly, the way she sometimes did in moments like this. He would have liked Colton, she believed. Not because Colton was easy to like, he wasn't particularly, but because her father had respected people who were honest about what they were. And she thought about the lawyer's office in Galveston, the word that had shaped everything, obligation, a marriage built on obligation, a promise made between 2 dead men that had landed on the living like an inheritance nobody had asked for. What she knew now, sitting at a small desk in a Fort Worth hotel, with her husband reading over her shoulder at the next thing she was already building, was that obligation was not the opposite of love. It was sometimes the beginning of it, not the romantic kind, not the kind that arrives with feeling and requires nothing else, but the real kind, the kind that's built from showing up and doing the hard work, and learning the shape of another person over time until you know them well enough that their absence would be the kind of loss that changes how the air feels. She hadn't planned for that. She'd planned for everything else, but not that. Lenora, Colton said. Close the notebook. She looked at him. Just for tonight, he said. It'll still be there tomorrow. She looked at the notebook for a moment, at the next 3 things, waiting in her careful handwriting. Then she closed it. The years after that were not simple. Nothing built on the scale they were building was ever simple. There were hard seasons and losses, Fawn. A disease that moved through the county in the 3rd year and cost the cooperative 40 animals before Whitfield's quarantine protocol contained it. A disagreement with Callow's group over facility expansion that took 8 months to resolve and tested relationships that had seemed solid. A drought in the fifth year that was worse than the one she'd arrived in, and which the cooperative survived because they had reserves and routing flexibility and a buyer network that didn't collapse when one element failed. She lost Dunmore in the fourth year, which was not a surprise. He was old and his health had been uncertain, but it was a loss that meant something beyond the practical. He was the one who had stayed when Peck's man came to the trail in the dark, who had held his ground because of 3 sentences she'd written in a campfire's dying light. She went to his funeral in Delwood and stood at the back because it was a small gathering and she didn't want to make it about herself. And afterward his wife found her on the way out and pressed her hand and didn't say anything. And Lenora didn't say anything either, and that was exactly right. She turned 35 on a working day. Colton remembered, and she didn't, which she found embarrassing and which he found quietly amusing. And the celebration was dinner at the kitchen table with food he'd arranged. Not cooked by him, he was honest about his limitations, but arranged. And a bottle of something she hadn't known was in the house. "You planned this," she said, "a week ago. How?" "I wrote it in the breeding records so I wouldn't forget. Under April." She stared at him. "You put my birthday in the breeding records." "It was available space." She laughed. It came out real and full and a little surprised, the way laughing does when something is genuinely funny rather than politely funny. And he watched her laugh with the expression he'd had since early on. That expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was something that lived near one, something that she'd learned over years was the closest he usually got to open happiness. "You're a strange man," she said. "You married me," he said. "Out of obligation," she said, and it landed the way old jokes land between people who have lived enough together to make them. Not as a wound reopened, but as a door into a shared past, proof that there was a past to share. He raised his glass. She raised hers. What the Texas frontier taught her, in the end, was not what she'd expected to learn. She had come expecting to survive it, to be competent enough to hold a place in it, to justify her presence through usefulness, to build something that would answer every person who told her, in one form or another, that she was in the wrong place. She had not expected to love it, but she did. She loved the specific quality of the light in October, the way it went gold and horizontal across the pasture in the late afternoon. She loved the sound of the herd in the early morning, the low collective breath of it, the patient animal presence. She loved the creek when it ran full after rain, which she had first seen in drought, and which ran past the eastern fence in a sound that she'd learned to sleep to. She loved the accumulated weight of the notebooks, 7 of them now, which together told a story of a place and a life and a set of decisions made in real time by an imperfect person who did not always know the answer and found it anyway. The cooperative had 12 member ranches by the 7th year. The Fort Worth processing facility had handled over 40,000 head since opening. The extension program through Whitfield's college had put the crossbreeding methodology into the hands of 80 ranchers across the region, most of them small operators who could not have afforded the Voss bulls directly, but could use the documented system to improve their own stock incrementally. None of this happened because she was extraordinary. She thought about this sometimes, clearly, without false modesty and without overclaiming. She had been smart, and she had worked hard, and she had been, in some ways, lucky. Lucky to have a father who believed that knowledge was not gendered, lucky to have arrived in a place where the problems were specific enough that specific knowledge could solve them, lucky that Colton Voss had been capable of changing his mind. But mostly what she had been was willing to be wrong and keep going, willing to be underestimated for as long as the work required it, willing to ask for less than she deserved in the short term in order to build something that would outlast the argument about whether she deserved it. That was not a lesson she could write in a notebook. It was the kind of thing you had to find out by doing it, in the specific and unglamorous way that most important things get found out. One decision at a time, in bad weather, without knowing for certain that any of it would work. Colton came to find her on a late afternoon in October of the 7th year. She was in the south pasture, looking at the herd the way she still did, reading it the way some people read weather. He rode up beside her and stopped, and they looked at the cattle together in the gold afternoon light, 400 and some animals on land that had been drought dry when she arrived, running a genetic line that was now documented and studied and copied by ranches she'd never visited in counties she'd never been to. Prewitt's coming next week, he said. Wants to talk about the northern expansion. I know, I have notes. Of course you do. She looked at the herd. One of the third-generation bulls stood at the edge of the group with the particular settled authority of a good animal in good condition, and she felt the specific satisfaction of a person looking at something they built from what was available and finding it was what they'd imagined it could be. Colton, she said. My father made a promise to your father that turned into this, she said. I've been thinking about that. He was quiet for a moment. What about it? Just that it's interesting, what obligations become if you take them seriously. She looked at the herd. He thought he was keeping a man's ranch from failing. What he actually did was put me somewhere I could do what I was built to do. Colton looked at her in the October light, this man she had married out of necessity and learned to love out of time and truth and the specific accumulated knowledge of another person that you can only build by staying. Your father was a smart man, he said. He was, she said. So was yours. They sat with that for a moment, the two of them on horseback in the late afternoon on land that bore both their names, looking at something they had built together from what they'd each brought, from the specific combination of what they knew and what they lacked, which had turned out to be not a perfect fit. Nothing was a perfect fit, but a real one. That was enough. That was, she had come to understand, considerably more than enough. The herd moved slowly in the golden light, and the creek ran along the eastern fence, and the notebooks waited on the table in the house with the next things already written in them. And Lenora Voss, who had arrived in Texas in a slightly squashed hat, with 2 trunks and a crate of books and no guarantee of anything, looked at what she'd made and found it was exactly as large as the work had been. She turned her horse toward home.